At 9:04 p.m. on a Tuesday in March, a woman dials 999 and screams down the phone that her husband has hanged himself with a belt.
Hello, can I have a ambulance, please? My husband's hung himself.
Okay.
And my husband's dead, like, on a level.
Okay, my darling. Okay. Oh no, my darling. Oh no. I'm going to get some help arranged. I'm going to get some help arranged, okay?
Just give me skate compression, it's terrible.
Paramedics arrive 11 minutes later to find her performing CPR on his unconscious body, shouting his name, asking him why he's done this to himself.
Yeah, received.
Just wake him up, please.
I know, darling, come in here.
He hadn't done anything to himself. The injuries to his neck told a completely different story than the one she was already telling. And 20 minutes before that call was ever made, while her husband lay dying in front of her, she had picked up the phone, not to call an ambulance, but to call her own father. This is the story of Kyle Pugh and the wife who tried to turn her own violence into his suicide. Now, if this is your first time here, I'm really glad you found this channel. Every day, I dive deep into real criminal cases, breaking them down piece by piece so we can actually understand what happened and why. If that sounds like something you'd be into, go ahead and hit subscribe. It's free, and it means a lot. Okay, now let's get back to the case. Kyle Pugh was 29 years old, a father of 3, and by every account given after his death, someone who filled a lot of different roles in the community around Newport and the neighboring Hollinswood area. He was known locally as an MC and artist, someone who performed and made a name for himself creatively long before anything about his private life ever became public. Kyle had also built something of his own professionally. He was the founder and driving force behind a design venture called Design Dudes UK, and his family would later describe him as a genuine visionary in that field, someone capable of turning his hand to almost anything. He used the garage at the Aston Drive house, the same address where his marriage had been based, as a workshop, a physical space dedicated to the creative work that clearly mattered to him. By the time of his death, Kyle and his wife Amy had separated, and he had moved into a new relationship. He was, in the final hours of his life, doing exactly what a man building a new chapter for himself tends to do, reaching out. That evening, he sent messages to his new girlfriend, to his father, and to friends, making plans to see them later that night. Ordinary, forward-looking messages, the kind sent by someone thinking about the rest of his week, not the end of his life. His family's tribute after his death captured him plainly, a beloved son, brother, uncle, and friend to many. They remembered him as a man of many talents, someone who still had, in their words, so much more to give. What none of them knew, in the hours after his death, was that the story they were first told about how he died was a complete fabrication. There is a quiet detail worth sitting with, one that the trial itself would later use to argue against the story told about his final hours. Kyle had genuinely struggled with self-harm in the past, and had, at points in his life, attempted to take his own life. That history was real, and it was well known to the people around him. But real vulnerability is not the same as intent, and the messages he sent that final evening to his girlfriend, to his father, to his friends, arranging to see them, reflect someone engaging with his life rather than preparing to leave it. It's a distinction that would go on to matter enormously once his death was reframed by someone else entirely. Amy Pugh was 34 years old, living on Stafford Road in Wolverhampton at the time of her arrest, though the marriage itself had been based at the Aston Drive property in Newport, Shropshire, where she and Kyle had once lived together. By March 2022, the couple had separated, though Kyle continued visiting the house, a pattern common enough among separated couples, still working out the practical details of ending a relationship. Police who investigated the case would later describe what existed between Amy and Kyle in blunt terms: a volatile, turbulent, and abusive relationship. Even Amy herself, giving evidence in her own defense, agreed with that assessment, describing the relationship as toxic, shaped by alcohol and substance use on both sides. This wasn't a marriage that ended quietly. It was one that had, by all accounts, been difficult and combustible for some time before it reached its final, fatal night. There was also history here that went beyond arguments and separation. More than a year before Kyle's death, in October 2021, Amy had set fire to his workshop, the same garage space he used for his creative work. While it burned, she sent him videos of the flames, singing along to Johnny Cash's Ring of Fire as she filmed it. It's a detail that, once known, recontextualizes everything that came after it, evidence not simply of a marriage falling apart, but of a pattern of deliberate, targeted harm against Kyle specifically, carried out well before the night that would eventually end his life. That earlier incident did not immediately end the relationship, nor did it appear to change how Kyle approached his contact with Amy in the months that followed. Whatever damage the fire caused, to the workshop, to the trust between them, it clearly wasn't enough, at the time, for Kyle to treat her as someone he needed to keep at a distance. It would take a second, far more serious act of violence before anyone outside the relationship would come to understand just how dangerous that pattern had actually become. None of that history stopped Kyle from continuing to see her, continuing to visit the house they had once shared, continuing to try to work through whatever remained unresolved between them. On the night of 22 March 2022, that continued contact brought him back to Aston Drive one final time. It's worth pausing on how ordinary that continued contact would have looked from the outside. Separated couples, particularly those who once built a life and a home together, often continue to see each other, argue with each other, and circle back around unresolved feelings for months or years after officially splitting up. Nothing about Kyle visiting his estranged wife that Tuesday evening would have struck anyone as unusual or alarming. It was simply one more evening in a pattern that had likely repeated itself many times before, one that, on every previous occasion, had ended with both of them still alive. The argument that led to Kyle's death began over something specific, whether his new girlfriend was pregnant. It's a small, almost mundane trigger for what followed, the kind of jealous, unresolved question that tends to surface between separated couples who haven't fully let go of each other, magnified here by a relationship both of them later described as toxic and volatile. What makes this case different from a slow-building pattern of escalating threats is how quickly things turned physical that night. There was no lengthy build-up described at trial, no weeks of rising tension leading to this specific date. Just after 8:30 in the evening, the conversation about his girlfriend's pregnancy tipped into a physical fight. Amy struck Kyle. He struck her back. According to the evidence presented in court, that exchange might have ended there, as many arguments between separated partners do, with both people bruised, angry, and eventually calming down. Instead, Amy grabbed hold of Kyle and pulled him down. What followed, in the words used by prosecutors, was further violence, escalating from a fistfight into something considerably more dangerous. At some point during that struggle, Amy applied pressure to Kyle's neck, compressing it by some means the court could not precisely determine, possibly some form of headlock or chokehold. The blows Amy landed on his face were forceful enough to break his nose and fracture his eye socket, but it was the compression to his neck that would prove fatal, cutting off Kyle's ability to breathe until he lost consciousness entirely. Within a matter of minutes, an argument over a text message and a suspected pregnancy had become something neither of them could walk back from. Once Kyle became unresponsive inside the house on Aston Drive, Newport, Shropshire, Amy did not immediately call for help. According to the evidence heard at trial, she made this decision consciously, recognizing that he was no longer reacting to her and choosing, in that moment, not to dial emergency services. Instead, she picked up her phone and called her father. Not once, but several times, including one video call that lasted a full 6 minutes. During that same window, she also took a phone call that came through on Kyle's own phone from his girlfriend, apparently unaware of what had just happened only feet away. Kyle's phone was never recovered by investigators afterwards. It was not until 9:04 p.m., roughly 20 minutes after Kyle had been rendered unconscious, that Amy finally called 999.
Hello, can I have a ambulance, please? My husband's hung himself.
Okay.
And my husband's dead, like, on a level.
Okay, my darling. Okay. Oh no, my darling. Oh no. I'm going to get some help arranged. I'm going to get some help arranged, okay?
Just give me skin compression, it's terrible.
When she did, she told the operator a story, with no basis in what had actually happened, that her husband had hanged himself using a belt. She sounded, by the account given in court, like a distraught and desperate wife, at one point audibly shouting into the phone, "Kyle, wake up, why have you done this?" Paramedics arrived at 9:15 p.m. and found Amy performing CPR on Kyle's unresponsive body. They were able to restore a pulse,
Please wake him up, please.
and he was taken to Princess Royal Hospital in Telford. He never regained consciousness. Kyle Pugh died there the following day, 23 March 2022. A post-mortem examination told a story entirely different from the one Amy had given at the scene. There was no evidence consistent with hanging. What the examination confirmed instead were fatal neck compression injuries, the kind caused by sustained external pressure applied during a physical struggle, not the kind left behind by a belt used in suicide. In her own police interview afterwards, Amy offered yet another version of events.
I've been sitting here playing music, drinking. Just telling him to go himself, thinking that he's not here, that he's on the way to his girlfriend's. I've been literally sat here thinking the most horriblest things about him.
Speak to your dad, okay? Speak to your dad.
So
Telling officers she had gone out the back door to let the dog out, discovered Kyle there, dragged him into the house, and tried to wake him by slapping his face. It was an account that shifted the location and the immediate circumstances of the discovery, while still avoiding any admission of what had actually caused his injuries. Investigators would eventually have to weigh that account and the 999 call before it against a growing body of physical evidence that supported neither version. The forensic case against Amy Pugh rested on a direct and fairly stark contradiction. The physical evidence recovered from Kyle's body simply did not match the account she had given emergency services on the night he died. A post-mortem examination identifying neck compression injuries rather than the ligature marks and pattern of injury typically associated with hanging effectively dismantled her story before the investigation had even properly begun. That contradiction became the spine of the prosecution's case, but it wasn't the only thread investigators pulled on. The 20-minute gap between Kyle becoming unresponsive and Amy's eventual 999 call proved just as significant. Rather than being a simple delay caused by panic, the pattern of her phone activity during that window, multiple calls to her father, including one lasting 6 full minutes, suggested a person making decisions, not someone in a state of shock, incapable of picking up a phone. Prosecutors argued this was time spent working out what to do next, rather than time spent trying and failing to process what had just happened. Digital evidence added a further complication. Kyle's own phone rang during this same period, with his girlfriend calling and Amy answering it. That call placed Amy in direct contact with someone in Kyle's life at almost the exact moment he lay dying, someone with no idea anything was wrong. The fact that Kyle's phone was never subsequently recovered removed a potential source of additional evidence, messages, call logs, timestamps, that might otherwise have helped establish an even more precise picture of that evening. Perhaps the most powerful piece of evidence, though, wasn't forensic or digital at all. It was Kyle's own final messages, sent to his girlfriend, his father, and his friends that same evening, making plans to see them later. These weren't the words of a man contemplating suicide. They were the ordinary, forward-looking messages of someone expecting to be alive the next day. Prosecutors used this directly to challenge the credibility of Amy's account, arguing she had taken advantage of Kyle's genuine history of self-harm to construct a story that might otherwise have seemed plausible to anyone unfamiliar with how he had actually spent his final hours. The trial itself, running 6 weeks at Stafford Crown Court, reflects just how much work was required to assemble this case into something a jury could weigh with confidence. Circumstantial and forensic evidence had to be laid out methodically. The post-mortem findings, the timeline of phone calls, the messages Kyle sent that evening, each element building toward the same conclusion from a different direction. It's a useful reminder that even when the physical evidence points strongly in one direction, as it did here with the mismatch between hanging and neck compression, prosecutors still need to construct a complete, coherent account of intent and behavior before a jury will convict, particularly in a case built without a single eyewitness to the violence itself. Nothing here is a clinical diagnosis of Amy Pugh. It's an attempt to understand the pattern behind her actions, drawn only from what was established in court and by the police who investigated the case. What stands out most in this case is the specific choice Amy made in constructing her cover story. She didn't claim an accident, or an intruder, or a memory blank. She built her account around Kyle's own genuine, documented history of self-harm and past suicide attempts, using something real and painful about his life as the raw material for a lie designed to protect her. That is a particular kind of manipulation, one that doesn't just deny responsibility, but actively repurposes a victim's own vulnerabilities against him after he is no longer able to speak for himself. The decision not to call for help immediately deserves its own attention. 20 minutes is a long time when someone's life may still hang in the balance. Choosing, in that window, to contact her father rather than emergency services suggests a person already thinking beyond the immediate crisis in front of her, toward what would need to happen next, and how the story would need to be shaped before anyone official became involved. That is a markedly different psychological posture than panic. Panic tends to produce chaotic, desperate action. What the evidence in this case points to instead is a kind of cold, sequential decision-making, harm first, containment second, cover story third. Detective Inspector Joe Delahaye, who led the investigation, made a point after sentencing of noting that Amy showed no remorse throughout the investigation or the trial. That absence matters here, not as a moral judgment, but as a psychological data point. Genuine accidents, followed by panic and a poorly conceived lie, often come apart under pressure, with the person eventually breaking down, admitting fault, expressing horror at what happened. Amy's account, by contrast, held its shape from the scene through her police interview all the way to a 6-week trial, where she maintained, tearfully, right to the end, that the version she was accused of, deliberately killing Kyle and constructing a false suicide, simply wasn't true. There's a further layer worth considering, drawn directly from the earlier arson attack on Kyle's workshop. That act, filmed and soundtracked with something as casual as a well-known song, suggests a capacity to treat serious harm almost performatively, as something to document and share rather than something to hide or regret. Seen alongside the calm, sequential decisions made on the night of Kyle's death, calls to her father before calls to an ambulance, a fabricated cause of death delivered convincingly to a 999 operator, a consistent pattern starts to emerge. Not someone incapable of controlling her actions in the moment, but someone consistently choosing self-protection over honesty, both before and after serious harm had already been done. The detail in this case that tends to generate the strongest reaction isn't the chokehold or even the 20-minute delay. It's the specific cruelty of the cover story Amy chose, framing Kyle's death as something he did to himself, using his own documented struggles with self-harm as the foundation for that lie. There's a particular kind of harm in that choice that goes beyond ordinary deception. It doesn't just protect the person telling the lie, it reshapes how the victim himself will be remembered, at least in the immediate aftermath, casting a man who had spent his final evening making plans with the people he loved as someone who had secretly been planning to end his own life. For a family already grieving an unexpected death, being told, even briefly, that their son had taken his own life, rather than been killed, adds an entirely different and entirely false layer of pain to process. This case also sits inside a broader and less comfortable conversation about how gender shapes public assumptions in domestic homicide cases. Much of the public language and awareness built up around intimate partner violence in Britain, understandably, centers on male perpetrators and female victims, because that pattern reflects the majority of cases. Kyle Pugh's death, and the years it took to bring Amy Pugh to trial, over 2 years passed between her arrest and her formal charge, sit outside that more familiar framing. It's worth asking, without minimizing the far larger pattern of violence against women, whether cases involving male victims and female perpetrators face their own particular hurdles in being recognized, investigated, and believed, especially when the victim, like Kyle, already had a documented history that made a suicide narrative superficially easy to accept. There's also the matter of the workshop fire, months before the killing itself. That earlier act, filmed and set to music, is difficult to categorize as anything other than a deliberate, personal act of cruelty aimed specifically at Kyle. Taken together with the toxic, volatile relationship both of them described at trial, it raises an uncomfortable question about how many warning signs existed, visible to people around them, long before the night things finally turned fatal, and whether earlier intervention, around a relationship both partners already called toxic, might have changed how this story ended. It's also worth considering how differently this case might have unfolded had Kyle survived that assault rather than died from it. A broken nose, a fractured eye socket, and a period of unconsciousness caused by neck compression, without the fatal outcome, might well have been prosecuted, if reported at all, as a lesser assault charge, with the full context of the earlier arson attack treated as a separate, unconnected incident, rather than part of a single, escalating pattern. It's often only once a case ends in death that investigators, courts, and the public look back and connect the dots between individual acts of harm that, taken on their own, might otherwise have been minimized or explained away. At sentencing, Judge Christina Montgomery KC described the dynamic between Kyle and Amy as volatile, fueled by alcohol and substance abuse, a relationship both of them had already called toxic long before that final night. It's a phrase that captures something true about this case without excusing any part of what followed. Two people caught in something destructive, but only one of them walked away from it alive, and only one of them then tried to rewrite what had actually happened. Kyle Pugh spent his final evening the way most people spend an ordinary Tuesday, texting the people he cared about, making small plans for later in the week. His family remembered him afterwards, not through the manner of his death, but through everything he had built while he was alive: a local performer, a designer, a father of 3, a man his own family said still had so much more to give. 20 minutes of hesitation and one lie about a belt took all of that away from him and from the people who loved him. 2.5 years passed between Amy's arrest and her eventual charge, and a further period still before the 6-week trial that finally established the truth. For Kyle's family, that meant living for years with an official record that hadn't yet caught up to what they already believed had happened to him. The verdict, when it finally came, didn't undo any of that waiting. What it did was formally close the gap between the story Amy told that night and the one his family had carried, largely alone, ever since. If you want to understand how a false cover story, no matter how convincingly delivered in a 999 call, can still be dismantled by a single post-mortem examination and the victim's own final messages, that's exactly the kind of story you'll find broken down on this channel every single day. If that's something you're into, hit subscribe, it's free, and it genuinely means a lot. Thank you for watching.